Hola y bienvenidos al programa de hoy. Soy Francisco Villarruel y los quiero invitar a suscribirse y darle like a este video. También los quiero invitar a ver el conversatorio que tuvimos con el profesor Robert Murphy, profesor y autor de muchos papers y libros, entre ellos Teoría del Caos, donde se discute un posible escenario o cómo se podría concebir una sociedad anarcocapitalista. Búsquenlo y compártanlo en nuestro canal. Y bueno, el día de hoy tenemos al profesor Patrick Newman, quien es miembro del Mises Institute y profesor de economía en Florida Southern College y miembro del Center for Free Enterprise. Él obtuvo su doctorado en la Universidad de George Mason. Y bueno, sus principales intereses de investigación incluyen, por ejemplo, la economía austriaca, la teoría monetaria y la historia económica estadounidense de finales del siglo XIX y principios del XX. Es editor, además, de Progressive Era, de Murray Rothbard, de 2017, y además escribió una brillante transcripción y edición del quinto volumen perdido de Rothbard. Bueno, este año él acaba de lanzar su nuevo libro, Cronismo, Libertad versus el poder de Estados Unidos, en Estados Unidos. So, Professor Newman, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be on.
Thank you. This year, you released your new book, Cronyism, Liberty versus Power in America, 1607, 1849. I must say, this is a very quite interesting book, full of small pieces and details that sometimes we don't find in common use history books. Before to talk about this book itself, I have three questions in one. The first, what inspired you to write about this topic? What is Cronyism? And the third, what is the liberty versus power theory?
Sure. So I was asked to write a book on the history of crony capitalism in the United States by someone. His name is Hunter Lewis. He's affiliated with the Mises Institute. He asked me to write the book in the fall of 2018, and I really started on working on it in the spring of 2019, and really just worked on it since then. So that's the main motivation. I've always been interested in economic history, particularly American economic history, and writing about the history of cronyism is something that really interests me. So I wanted to make this sort of a multi-volume series, if you will, and I wanted to focus on early America initially. So before continuing, again, answer your second question, what is cronyism? Well, traditionally, when politicians advocate policies, legislation, a tax and spending bill, some sort of subsidy, tariff, central banking, policy, whatever, they always advocate it or they justify it in terms of the public interest, saying we need to push for this tariff to protect jobs, or we need to develop more infrastructure, whatever, right? They gotta sell it to the taxpayer, so to speak. And in reality, that's just sort of a justification, right? That's kind of a nice sales tactic. But the vast majority of these policies are what could be defined as cronyism. And it's really when politicians push for policies not to benefit the overall public, but to benefit concentrated special interest groups at the expense of the public. So tariffs don't protect jobs. Tariffs privilege certain firms at the expense of other firms and consumers who have to pay higher prices. Subsidies promote inefficient businesses. They hurt the taxpayer, who obviously has to pay for all of this, so on and so forth. So when you actually look underneath sort of the rhetoric, which is really just kind of a thin veneer for crony policies, favors, etc., you actually find out that all of these policies are really crony, right? That they're advocated in the name of the public interest, but they actually don't benefit the public. Instead, they benefit various interest groups, right? So the sort of what I set out to do was to explain the history of cronyism in America. Okay, so why cronyism increased in certain periods, why then special privileges fell in other periods or maybe stayed the same, etc. And to do this, I use what I call the liberty versus power theory, which really comes from Murray Rothbard, which is that, at least under certain circumstances, which I argue applies to early America, it's that history is a clash between the forces of liberty, or groups that want to reduce cronyism, reform the system, so to speak, and the forces of power. So these are the groups that want to increase special interests, special interest policies and privileges for themselves or for their supporters, et cetera. So when power had, the forces of power control a government, such as the United States, we would expect cronyism to go up. When the forces of liberty control the government, we would expect cronyism to go down, right? Now, the complication, which is part of the liberty versus power theory, is that when the forces of liberty throughout American history, people who genuinely wanted to reform the system, these were mass movements, libertarian, they won elections, they could actually get policies done. They weren't just like a fringe third party or anything. When they won, cronyism only moderately declined before then increasing again. And this is because the second component of the liberty versus power theory is that power corrupts. The reformers, they then realize they need to grant privileges to their supporters to win election. They start to move towards other goals, so on and so forth. So this is really kind of the tension, or even when you have these reformers against cronyism, it's very hard to destroy cronyism, right? Because power corrupts. So I really write my history of cronyism of the United States, early American history, using this theory of liberty versus power.
Okay. The index of your book is kind of very long. There's a lot of topics, very detailed. I don't know, we cannot go through all these topics in just 25 minutes. So can you give us an idea of what we can find in your book or through your book?
Yeah, sure. So there's a lot of, as you mentioned, little juicy stories or little, hidden little nuggets and tidbits. And I try and put it in a whole narrative, an overarching narrative. One of my most favorite stories regarding, at least of an example of kind of cronyism, right, of politicians pushing for policies to benefit themselves and their supporters, actually relates to the establishment of the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. So where it was actually located. So most people, to the extent they know American history, they know that the capital, which is basically right outside of Virginia, in the United States, was established due to a compromise between the North and the South over debt funding at the beginning of the nation's founding, et cetera. What they don't know is that as a result of this compromise, they gave President George Washington the ability to choose the location of the capital within a very small, basically a little plot of land along the Potomac River. In Virginia and near Virginia and Maryland. And so what's funny is Washington wanted to move the capital actually outside of that square. He wanted to establish the capital outside of that block because it would be closer to all of his land in Alexandria. So he wanted to boost the property of his land, right? And he managed to do this by signing the Federalists, one of the most crony pieces of legislation, the Central Bank Bill, the first bank of the United States. So he said, all right, look, I'll allow for your central bank to pass, but you got to allow me you got to amend the law, what was known as the Residence Act, to allow me to put the capital where it would be built closer to my property, right? And as a result of this, the value of his property obviously exploded, right? And it's a huge benefit. And you can even still see this if you go to Washington, D.C. There's still his actual plantation, Mount Vernon, right next to the city. He's got there's like this ridiculous scenic highway named after him. And this is taking up a lot of land. So it's like all these hundreds of years later, right? The ghost of George Washington still lords over the Capitol. But that's one famous example, but there's a lot of examples of when you look at these various politicians, they might have noble rhetoric, et cetera, but again, they always have their hand in some sort of deal, right? And George Washington, our nation's founding father, was no exception.
Wow. There was no opposition to George Washington when he proposed move out of this square?
Yeah, so there was an incredible lot of opposition, but basically, so the party in power, the Federalists, agreed to it, provided that Washington basically scratched their back, like a little quid pro quo. He says, look, allow me to move the capital where we're going to build our new capital, and I'll sign, I won't veto the bank bill that was currently in Congress. So they basically shook hands. And this is something that happens a lot, where if one interest group wants one thing and another interest group wants another thing, well, instead of fighting, they'll just basically say, all right, look, pass my policy and I'll pass your policy.
Sounds like how we work today.
Yeah.
Since you mentioned the bank, also the first bank of the United States, banking systems and central banks are always hot topics, especially here in Chile, where I'm in the United States now. But talking about all monetary mercantilism, and you also mentioned in your book, legal tenders laws, what was the role of the government in the old banking system?
Yeah, so government and banking in the United States history, and really in most countries, unfortunately, it's always been heavily intertwined with banks, right? And this was because a lot of people don't know this, but this just not only deals with banking, but also all corporations. The corporation was initially started off as a creature of the government, because a corporation has multiple owners, and they own stock in the company, and they have the privilege of what's known as limited liability. So back in the day, if you wanted to start a corporation, you actually had to lobby the state legislature to charter a corporation for you. So some of the colonies were actually chartered as corporations. They were known as joint stock companies, right? They later became states, Virginia, for example, Massachusetts, and so on, right? And then banking was no different. So if you wanted to establish a bank, you had to basically lobby the state legislature or the Congress, the federal legislature, for a charter. And in this charter would not only be the corporate form, right? So you can use limited liability, et cetera, but various sorts of privileges, or again, a deal. The government would say, all right, look, you got to loan us money, right? And in return, we will make you a monopoly, right? So we won't charter any other banks for another 5 to 10 years. Right. So naturally, this process is very corrupt. Right. And so you'd always have banks. They would be lobbying the state legislature to get more privileges, or to try and block out other banks from, the state from chartering other banks, and so on. So banking in the government was always heavily linked. In the first Bank of the United States in America, our own, our first real modern central bank, so to speak, was no different. Congress chartered this bank, and it said, all right, in return, you got to loan us money, but this will be the only bank Congress will charter in 20 years. So it's a 20-year monopoly, which is ridiculous. I mean, it's very crony. And so this just shows you that monetary intervention has really been with us since the beginning of our country's founding.
Wow. Between 1775 and 1781, you mentioned that reactionaries imposed legal tenders laws to finance their military operations that throw out of circulation species. Can you explain to us how taxpayers ended up financing the public debt through speculation and debt instruments? How did it happen? If you can find any parallel in today's politics?
Yeah. So when the United States, we decided to secede against Great Britain. This was the Revolutionary War, and our governments, the relative, the various what became states, they unfortunately decided to have a formal army instead of a guerrilla warfare army. So they wanted a formal army to fight the British. Classic. You got to stand in line, you fire a volley, then the other side fight, like that, where basically humans are just sardines, so to speak. They're just cannon fodder. And in order to do so, that obviously takes a lot of money. So no one wanted to basically push for taxes, because they said, wait, we're rebelling against Great Britain because they're raising taxes. It would look a little bad if then we start to raise taxes on our own people. So what was devised was saying, all right, why don't we just print money? So we'll print money, most famously the Continental dollars that the Continental Congress printed, as well as other, various states printed their own money, saying that they're going to print money. These are dollars. We will promise to pay you in an equivalent amount of Spanish silver dollars, right? Because we mainly used Although, we use the pound for accounting purposes. During the colonial era, we used the Spanish silver dollar a lot. And so they said, all right, the military is going to just start paying for things with printed money. Well, very quickly, it became obvious that they were not going to repay in silver. And this money just started to depreciate. People said, no, this paper money is worthless. We're not going to accept it. So then at the local level, the state level, they pushed for legal tender laws saying, well, you have to accept it for a debt, right? Or various other payments. And when you did this, basically then no one used specie, right? Everyone's using the paper money. And this is causing all sorts of distortions because it's basically a hidden tax. The receivers of the new money are getting an increase in real income at the expense of the receivers of the late money. Right? This is a classic analysis Austrian economics and so on explains. And this was obviously very unpopular. And this is something that you still see today. Right? We see this now where inflation's rising, not only in the United States, but also in South America, et cetera. And many politicians, they're proposing price controls or some sort of other law, et cetera, forcing people to accept the money and so on. And it's kind of a cycle. Of course, because during the Revolutionary War, we also imposed price controls because, of course, the way you stop inflation is imposing price controls, which never works. It just leads to shortages. And now you hear the same thing today, that the way to stop high prices is price controls, but it's literally never worked, but that's never stopped politicians.
Oh, yeah. It's very unfortunate. We can see a lot of price control in, for example, for Venezuela is a big example. You can see the same in Argentina today. I remember in the middle of the pandemic, there was a lot of price control in everything related with health, something that helped you relieve you from COVID, these kind of things. There is also a very juicy topic. Maybe the audience don't necessarily know about American history. That's why I want to ask you if you can explain to us the historical importance of the Boston Tea Party of December 1773.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that last. What was explained?
If you can explain us about the Boston Tea Party.
Oh yeah, the Boston Tea Party. Yeah, so this is a famous event in American history. So building up to the American Revolutionary War, Great Britain was basically trying to impose what they called the grand design. So saying, look, we're going to impose all sorts of new taxes and regulations on the American colonies. We're going to make them pay for a part of the British Empire. And this was something that Americans increasingly fought against. So there's various acts that they fought against. They fought a tax on paper. Then there was this Tea Act that basically granted, more or less, in so many words, granted a monopoly to tea, and it was thought to be to other goods, to shipping tea to the United States. They gave this monopoly to the British East India Tea Company, right? And this was something that Americans were very against because they were against special monopolies that were chartered by the Parliament, the British government. This is an example of the corporation being a creature of the state I had mentioned earlier. And so Americans then decided in Boston, right? So in Massachusetts, in the northern part of the country, they said, well, we're going to show our displeasure and we're going to dump a bunch of tea of the Boston, of the East India, the British East India Tea Company into the water. Now, they were very cognizant of private property rights because they actually waited. We don't need to go too much into this. They waited until if the goods couldn't be shipped or they couldn't be unloaded in Boston, it would become the government's property for a certain period of time. So they basically waited until it became the government's property and then they unloaded it, right? So they were cognizant of private property rights. But this is a famous revolt against the British crown. And this shows how Americans, the American colonists, were very against cronyism initially. So they were against onerous and taxes, regulations, and so on. So it's an important piece of American history that I wish more people knew about.
Yeah. You mentioned in the book that Jacksonians, as the first Democrats, left more stuff done than Jeffersonians. that they were working also with British that were also trying to eliminate crony privileges in their own land. But in your opinion, what forces or facts pushes Democrats to Cronyism as well?
Yeah, so the Democrats, the Jacksonians, actually they founded the modern Democratic Party of the United States. So you think of President Joe Biden, he belongs to the Democratic Party. That party was actually founded in 1828, really by Andrew Jackson and his trusted advisor Martin Van Buren. So this may come as a shock, but the party was originally very libertarian, very laissez-faire. It was designed to fight cronyism, to fight special privileges. And they were actually fairly successful at doing this. It took about 15 years, but they slowly whittled away banking cronyism. They whittled away tariff cronyism. They paid off the national debt. They reduced government spending. They removed special privileges to corporations, so on and so forth. The big issue that really kind of weakened their drive against cronyism, and this is the same thing that sort of happened to the Jeffersonians, was land corrupted them. So it was the issue of westward expansion. Okay. And in particular, there was first the problem of annexing what was the independent country of Texas. So Texas had seceded from Mexico. Mexico at that time had control of Texas as well as what we now consider California. So there were many people in the United States who wanted to annex Texas, but many other people were against it because Texas had slaves, and it was seen as spreading the practice of slavery. So this split the Jacksonian Democrats. Jackson was for annexing Texas. Martin Van Buren was against. And then the Jacksonians, after annexing Texas, it's once you expand land, you always need more and more. They then pushed to really have a war of conquest against Mexico to take what's known as the American Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico. They went all the way to California, etc. And this really caused the debt to explode, and all sorts of various other crony privileges occurred during the Mexican-American War in the mid-1840s. And this really kind of wrecked the Jacksonians' drive to fight cronyism. And it's sort of the idea that you have to have this American empire, and it's always got to be expanding, but it's really hard to have a limited government over a very vast, territorial vast country. So in the end, the Jacksonians failed because they basically got corrupted by power, in particular, expanding the country's borders.
Mm-hmm. In the beginning of your book, you mentioned that Thomas Jefferson, when in the first draft the Constitution, he wanted to eliminate slavery, but he couldn't because he had to do a trade-off. But it's something that few people, or not maybe not few people, but most of people doesn't know. So it's this dispute about, the founder fathers believe in freedom, but at the same time they were masters. How do you think we can address that topic?
Yeah, this is an important issue because the idea of slavery, it's a very important topic in American history. I think Thomas Jefferson gets unfairly criticized now. Most recently, there was like a statue taken down of him in some New York political office, etc. Because he thought that he was what we would consider now a white supremacist. Thought white people were superior to black people, and he thought it was okay to own people, etc. And already off the bat, that's kind of disingenuous because one, everyone was racist back then. Like everyone just thought, so you had plenty of people who thought, white people were racially superior, just like in other parts of the world. People thought that they were superior compared to other groups, etc. This was just the sensibilities back then. Thomas Jefferson, he did also fight slavery. He did try and stop it. It was just a big struggle as necessarily what to do with it. And a lot of the problems with slavery at that time period, it really was more viewed through the lens of people who were fighting slavery or fighting the expansion of slavery were actually really just fighting the expansion of non-white people into certain territories. So the North got rid of its slavery first before the South, but the North, a lot of people don't know this, had a much smaller proportion of blacks living in the region in the North and the South. It was about 3% of the population versus 30%. And Northerners were no more racially, in terms of modern opinion, respectable. They supported segregation, restrictions on voting and suffrage for non-white people, et cetera. And these are things that we would obviously consider bad now, modern sensibilities. But this is also sort of, again, it's unfair to criticize people using modern ethical standards. So what I try and do is I look more at what Jefferson tried to at least push for. Right. So in the Declaration of Independence, he tried to criticize slavery. In the Ordinance of 1784, he tried to stop the expansion of slavery in the West. During his presidency, he pushed for the end to the international slave trade. So for Americans to basically import slaves from the Caribbean that were shipped from Africa, et cetera. And this is something that I think gets neglected too much. But it's important to look at. Was he perfect against slavery? Absolutely not. Were there contradictions? There absolutely were. But we have to sort of appreciate these or trying to understand them rather than just sort of hastily dismissing someone, right? And the slavery was a very important issue in American history, and it deserves to get studied. But I think there needs to be a bit of more accurate emphasis on certain things, which I believe I try to do in my own book.
Sure. I have two more questions. You wrote that the Enlightenment that swept the colonies stressed man's inner reasons and ability to discover the world's natural laws. I want to address the conflict that postmodernism has brought to us between reason and subjectivism as a way to measure reality. I think reason is perhaps one of the few tools we have to unfold the truth from a human perspective, of course, what we can know as a truth. For example, as your book reveals, the past Cronyism in America, something that we need to know is part of our truth, let's say. You research, you collect piece of information, historical data, you use your mind, your reasons to distinguish between true and false, important or unimportant, etc. But today I'm seeing more commonly that how feel things are is more important than what empirical evidence or factual data shows to us. Cronyism is a byproduct of politicians, and politics is about making people believe politicians will always do the greatest good to them or to us, so they can be elected or re-elected continuously. So for me, there is no question that politicians appeal to the voters' feelings, hiding somehow what they actually do every day. So perhaps my question is how we can defeat Cronyism in a world that seems every day more like leading forward towards pure subjectivism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I would, when you asked this question, one quote immediately came to my mind is by Ludwig von Mises, and it's something along the lines of, man has only one tool to fight error, reason, right? And in a sense, it's very profound, and it's important because, reason, our ability to understand the world, our ability to understand the objective conditions of the world, this is why we live so much better compared to the past. We know how the world works. We know the human body works. We know how the economy works, or at least we did. We know how technology works, et cetera. And this idea of, well, everything can be subjective, postmodern. It's more, I think, our technology or human biology, et cetera, hasn't caught up to modern ethical standards. So people just say, well, as long as I believe it, well, then that's okay. And I can just believe something and you can believe something else, because me believing this thing makes me feel comfortable. And that's just a recipe for disaster. I think the only way of really fighting it is just continuing to push for education, continuing to push for fact-based or logic-based arguments, et cetera, and really just trying to show people historically when we've abandoned this type of reasoning, so to speak, or logical argumentation and using facts and empirical evidence, bad things happen. And I think people need to understand more about economics, because economics is the study of what is, not what should be, right? Everyone would love to live in a world where various sorts of problems would go away and we'd all be living happily, et cetera. But we live in a world of scarcity, right? We live in a world of choice. There are constraints. So I really think just it's at least off what I would argue is just really trying to continue that educational battle, really just sort of pushing for more and more reason-based arguments, trying to show in particular, economics, teach economics, economic law, et cetera. That's really all we can do. So I know we've been doing this, but then it brings my mind to another quote. And it's sort of, well, one more time, but with feeling, right? So it's like, we got to give it, another, we got to, till the dying breath, we got to keep fighting for the struggle, so to speak.
Is there any book that you recommend to the audience, the basic one that a citizen should know about economics?
Yes, absolutely. I would say Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. That's one of my first books that I read. I was enormously influenced by this book. I would also say Murray Rothbard's What Has Government Done to Our Money? That's a classic book, just again, really just sort of explaining the basics of money and inflation. But the Henry Hazlitt book, absolutely. The Murray Rothbard book. Those I would say are the most important. I believe Per Byland, who's a associated scholar at the Institute, like me, he's a fellow. He's got a new book coming out on the just a short introduction to Austrian economics. I heartily recommend people to read that when that comes out. I think it's coming out next year. But yeah, I would just basically say the Henry Hazlitt is first and foremost. That's a classic. Everyone should read Economics in One Lesson.
Wonderful. I have one more question. I always struggle comparing the ideal world versus the real pragmatic world. Here is one of my struggle. As a libertarian, do you think we can have, let me use maybe a dating app terminology here, we can have a match between being a libertarian, like a classical liberal, who strives to get a small, limited government, but knowing that government needs to be financed. So can we, as libertarians, support a small taxation, even if it's used in an extremely well-efficient fashion, or is any kind of tax a thief we shouldn't support, at least as a principle?
Well, I think, in terms of I agree with you, there is a difference between principles, the abstract and the practical. So for example, I believe taxation is theft. I'm an anarcho-capitalist in theory. You don't need government, et cetera. Is that likely to come about soon? No, not at all, right? The best we can hope for is a more limited government situation. I would love to live under a government that only provides law and order, right? But even then, that's not likely to happen. I would, just even try and getting rid of one tax or a couple taxes. That's just like a good first step. I think we can support, it really just comes down to the nature of reform. I don't think libertarians can support raising taxes, but we can support, trimming away, slowly whittling away the edifice of taxation, regulations, government spending, and so on, right? So, in terms of what we're trying to accomplish now, well, you just try and accomplish the certain reforms that you can get passed, in a local government or in a legislature, et cetera. So, supporting some sort of legalization of drugs, right? That's a step towards the free market. Is that the only thing you want to get done in the abstract? No, but is that just what you can do now, given the political climate, et cetera, maybe, and so on. So I think, in terms of pushing for lower taxes, I think the idea is you should always be fighting for lower taxes. You shouldn't be looking to raise taxes, but you have to know where the battle is. So, you're not going to be able to get rid of the government in one foul swoop. You have to basically slowly kind of chop away at it, basically.
That's fantastic. When people can buy your book?
People can buy the book on Amazon. So it's available on Amazon. And you can just type in Patrick Newman Cronyism and you should see it. You can get it in paperback. You can get it in hardcover. If you'd like to get it autographed, you could also buy it through the Mises.org bookstore. And so you can get it through multiple outlets. And I'd love for people to buy the book and to read it. If anyone ever has any questions, you can always send me an email. I'm happy to answer it, or find me on social media at Dr. Patrick Newman. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, etc. So you can get the book through multiple means.
That's fantastic. Professor Patrick Newman, thank you so much for being with us today. And we're looking forward to having you later in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on, and I'd love to be on again in the future.